Thank you very much. Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for the invitation to give the presentation here. The presentation, which is called Recovering Growth or a Growthless Recovery. And I want to talk, in the first part, I want to talk with you about three things. I want to talk with you about a tennis ball. I want to talk with you about Colina, the old referee, retired referee. Some of you may know him, especially those who follow football. Not the FIFA, football, something different. And the third subject I want to discuss with you is cars, a Trabant. Is it a car? I don't know, but let's suppose it's a car. It was a car. First of all, the tennis ball. Ladies and gentlemen, if you smash a tennis ball on the floor, what does it do? It jumps up. It jumps up. And then it moves on. It moves on, but it slows down. If you don't manipulate it, if you don't stimulate it, if you don't hit it again, it slows down until it stops. Well, the tennis ball stands for Europe and the European economy. The European economy behaved like a tennis ball that was smashed on the ground with a lot of force. In 2008, 2009, tennis ball came down, then it jumped up and everybody was talking about a recovery, the crisis is behind us, and then it moved down, it moved down, it moved down, but sometimes economic growth in Europe was a little bit above the 0% line. Is there a pointer? Yes. No, there isn't. The 0% growth line, and sometimes it was a little bit under the 0% growth line. But in general, it was not that dynamic. And why wasn't it dynamic? Because the economy, after the fall in 2008, 2009, wasn't stimulated a lot. There wasn't a new hit on that economic tennis ball. Because in Europe exists when the sun shines. Then everybody, it's one big continent. And everybody has the same goal. But when it's raining, when there are economic or political difficulties, then Europe doesn't exist. It are 28 individual countries. And on top of that, as a reaction to the crisis, there was something, I don't know, there was a meeting, there was a G20 meeting in Toronto. And I don't know what was in the water there or in the food, but after the leaders, European political leaders came back, all of a sudden they started talking about cutting budgets. And that, from an economic point of view, that's exactly what you don't have to do when your economic tennis ball is falling. You have to do the opposite. You have to do the opposite. There was one institution, one real European institution that did something, that tried to manipulate, to motivate, to stimulate, that's the word, to stimulate the economic ball. It was the European Central Bank. It was Mario Draghi. What did Mario Draghi, European Central Bank, do? Especially in January of this year, they copied the American measures. What did the Federal Reserve do? The American counterpart of the ECB, the Federal Reserve, American Central Bank, the former president, Mr. Bernanke, as soon as 2008, 2009, he went to a computer store, he bought a huge printer, and he started to print money. Then he went to the airport, stepped into his helicopter, and distributed the money above the economy. 2009, 2012, 2013, what did the ECB do? The ECB made money very cheap. Lowered interest rates, money for free. But in January of this year, Mario Draghi announced, I'm going to buy a printer too. The same huge model, the same huge printer, and I start to print money too, like Ben Bernanke did. And that's a very controversial measure, because we are not sure it will help. We are not sure that the disadvantages of that policy, for instance, bubbles on the financial markets, we are not sure that the disadvantages won't overshadow the advantages. It's very controversial. In the economic world, but also in the broad society. Maybe you saw these pictures or these images. The press conference of Mario Draghi in March of this year, all of a sudden there was a woman that jumped on his desk to protest against the ECB policy. By the way, it was the first time that I saw an Italian man who had to be protected against a woman. Normally it's the other way around. Nevertheless, the European economic car is moving again. And it's not moving on its own motor. It needs some help. It needs some help from some friends. And one of these friends is the weaker euro. Given the fact that the ECB, that Mario Draghi started to print money, all of a sudden there was an oversupply, a large supply of euros. When there's an oversupply of something, what happens with the price? It becomes cheaper. The same with the euro. From the moment Mario Draghi started printing, the euro decreased. And that helps our export. That stimulates the export, that stimulates the economy, in theory. And the second friend that came to help our economy, our European economic car, is lower energy prices, lower oil prices. So the economic car is moving again, albeit at a slow pace, and not on its own motor. They have to carry it. But it's moving. It's moving. And what you see is that the economic surprise index. What is the economic surprise index? Is an index that's calculated by our colleagues of Citigroup. Economic surprise index is an index that measures the new economic figures, new economic data. And whenever a new figure comes out above expectations, the economic surprise index experiences an uptick. Whenever a new figure, new data comes out under expectations, under consensus, the economic surprise index experiences a downtick. And what you see is, from the moment that markets started to whisper about the printing policy of the ECB, from the third quarter of 2014 on, in the first months of this year, the European economic surprise index increases. So new economic data surprised us. Yeah, I suppose. Yeah. It was especially the lower energy prices, the cheaper oil, that helped us. Internal demand in Europe, retail sales, worldwide, retail sales started to increase as soon as oil prices started to collapse. And what you see is that there's there's more optimism in the economic surprise index, but also international organizations like the World Bank, like the IMF, like the OECD, they started to revise the economic growth projections and expectations for Europe upwards. We experienced upward revisions of economic growth for 2015 and 2016. And like I said, especially the lower energy prices helped us. The lower euro, the cheaper euro, that effect is not noticeable for the moment. But if you look at the export orders, the order book from European companies, it's relatively flat. Unless the fact that the euro is cheaper, for instance, against the dollar, the order book remains relatively flat. And why is that? That is because of the question marks about the economy, the economies in Asia. I come back to that later. And the question marks about the economy in the United States. And that brings me to the United States, and the second item I want to discuss with you. First, we have the tennis ball, the European economy, that's moving again, thanks to the cheaper euro and the cheaper oil prices. Second item, Colina. Why Colina? Colina was a referee who was very severe, very strict, who took vigorous decisions, but he was respected, but very hard, very strict. And that's why Colina stands for the United States. How did the United States react to the crisis? By printing money. Immediately. 2008, 2009. On top of that, the United States reorganized the banking sector immediately. In Europe, we are discussing for 4, 5, 6 years now, which bank is healthy, what should we do with the banks, how can banks, who is responsible for the losses in the bank in the United States? They regulated it, they intervened immediately. They said to two banks, you and you have to merge. You have to raise capital, and you, I'm sorry, will let you down. And that's one of the reasons why economic growth difference between, for instance, Germany, the strongest country within Europe, and the United States, since 2008, it's quite considerable, the growth difference. However, during these last months, the economic surprise index, the dark line for the US, is decreasing. The momentum seems to disappear. There was a quick recovery from 2008, 2009 on, but now it slows down. It slows down. Economic figures that come out are very often under expectations, under consensus. And growth revisions in Europe, they were upwards. In the States, they are downwards. One of the explanations is the bad weather. This is a weather map from the United States from January or February. We had a very severe winter in the northeast of the United States. That hasn't helped the economy during these last months. On the other hand, I checked it. It was not the first time in New York that it snowed in January. It has snowed before. So maybe there's more. There's more to explain the slowdown in the American economy. And what could be an explanation is this. In Europe, European consumers spend their energy dividends. Lower energy prices gives an energy dividend. In fact, the economic effect is the same as a tax reduction. Americans, they spend like crazy. And 2/3 of the American economy is made out by the American consumer, the American individuals. And what do we see during these last weeks and last months? Real earnings of individual Americans, of American households, real earnings increase. But they don't spend it, they save it. Americans save more. You see here? And consumption goes down. And that could be an explanation why the American economy in general slows down a bit. And this is also a crucial factor for the coming weeks and coming months. 2/3 of the American economy is represented by the consumers. If the consumers spend, the economy grows, and vice versa. So that is one explanation. Does that mean that we have to be pessimistic about the American growth for the coming months? And if we are pessimistic for the American growth, it's very difficult to be optimistic about European growth, and it's very difficult to be optimistic about the worldwide growth. Are we pessimistic for American growth coming weeks, coming months? No. Because if you look at the sentiment, so consumers don't consume, or they don't consume enough for the moment. They don't spend their energy dividend. But if we look at their sentiment, how do they feel? They feel quite well. And normally, after a certain period, the real consumption follows the sentiment. And they feel well because the housing market is recovering, because stock markets are booming, because interest rates are still low. So we think from the side of the consumer, they will start to consume in 2, 3, 4 months. And also looking at the sentiment from corporate America, for instance, the ISM index. What is the ISM index? The ISM index is the index that measures the sentiment with purchasing managers. And why purchasing managers? Because they are at the beginning of the production cycle. When an economy accelerates, they feel it immediately. And the correlation between the ISM, this sentiment index, the correlation between the ISM index and US growth, it's almost touching, the correlation. And what we see here is that ISM index, confidence, sentiment, is rather optimistic. So we have confidence that growth will pick up to go in the direction of that sentiment. So America, we have to be a little bit careful. On the other hand, we think that the situation will improve during the coming weeks and coming months. And it's important, again, for the United States, but also for us, and for world growth in general. Third item I want to discuss with you, we have the tennis ball, Europe, we have Paulina, United States, the Trabant. Does anyone know the delivery time of a Trabant in Eastern Germany? I, as a German, I buy a Trabant, or I order a Trabant. How long did I have to wait?
10 years.
Who says more? 50 years. 12 to 15 years. And why was that? Because the economy was totally centrally planned. There were no impulses from the market that were taken into account. If someone in Berlin decided we have to produce 5 million left shoes, they started to produce 5 million left shoes. No matter if there was any demand for left shoes and no matter the right one. It was not important. The Trabant stands for China. Because China has to avoid the Trabant scenario. The Trabant scenario with a completely inefficient economy. And an economy that doesn't manage to stimulate purchasing power with its people. The Chinese economy, for 2-3 decades was not totally planned, but to a large extent it was planned. And the economic model was based on heavy industry and export. And now the economic ship of China has to change direction. No longer based on heavy industry and export, but based on internal demand. Now, if an economic oil tanker, a huge economic oil tanker, has to change direction, speed slows down. It's normal. It's very normal. And what you see is that growth rates in China are no longer 12%, 13% on a yearly basis. This is on a quarterly basis, but 12, 13, 14% a year. But now it cools down to, let's say, 6.5%, 7.5%. And that's completely normal, because they have to change direction. On the other hand, it's a very delicate process, because for economic reasons, but also for political reasons, for social reasons, growth has to keep a certain level. It may not slow down too much. And that's why what we see these last months, that the Chinese authorities fall back on the old recipe. The old recipe, what means that to stimulate the export, to stimulate the economy, they make, for instance, they make money cheaper. They decrease interest rates. And they say to banks, the reserve ratio, they say to banks, yeah, you have deposits for 100. Normally you have to keep in your reserves, I don't know, 30. Now just keep 20, and the other 10 give loans to companies, to households, to stimulate the economy. That's the old recipe. That's the old recipe. In China, I think that the newly elected president, not elected, the appointed president, for 2 years now, he has a hell of a job. Because have you ever managed 1.4 billion people? 1.4 billion people have to be managed from economic direction A, heavy industry based, export based, to economic direction B, internal demand based. That's a hell of a job. And he has a lot on his mind, because he will also fight the corruption. He cannot spend 100% of his time on the economic change, the direction change, of into the corruption. So he has a lot on his mind, not only at the office, but also when he comes home at night. because this is his wife? That's another question. So as a conclusion, an overview, an economic overview of the world, Europe living on hope. We are helped by cheaper euro, we are helped by cheaper oil prices, but internal dynamism is not that good. The United States, a small step backwards. The wind had to do with it, the consumer had to do with it, but still walking, and maybe towards the end of the year running again. And China, the dish cools down. It's normal during a change of direction, but old ingredients should make it more spicy again in the short term. In the longer term, they have to keep that change going on. So, careful optimism for the world economy in the short term. However, economics, it's not a spreadsheet. When an engineer tries to calculate something, it's an exact science. More or less, I see on your face. More or less. But in economy, it's about people. So it's uncertain. So we are careful, optimistic, but everything can happen. And there are three main things that keep me awake at night. For my profession. And the first thing that keeps me awake at night is China. Because China has to change the economic direction, but there's potentially a big problem. And the big problem is summarized in this quote, a quote from the Wall Street Journal, and a quote of the founder of Yuli.com. Yuli.com basically is a crowdfunding website. If a Chinese household wants a loan, they can go to the bank or they can go to the neighbors. And the neighbors are on the Yuli.com website registered. And he says, the founder said, for a couple of months, every time we posted a loan, it sold out in seconds. And if we take that at a macro level, if we look at the Chinese debt mountain from 2008 to 2009 on, it's almost an exponential growth. Within non-financial corporations, but also households. And a lot of this debt is linked to the real estate. And a lot of this debt is linked on mortgages. Now, I was in China 4 or 5 weeks ago and spent some time in several cities. For instance, in Chengdu in the middle of China. The northeast and south coast of China is developed, whereas there is a middle class that's coming up, that's established almost. And if you go to the inland, to the west, there it still has to begin. For instance, in Chengdu, a city of 15 million people, and you drive through that city for 2 hours between apartments. And all the apartments were empty. Every single apartment was empty. And I asked, but isn't there any oversupply? No. Within 2 years, they will be sold. I stopped, or asked the driver to stop, to take a closer look. But I think that between now and 2 years, if it rains 10 times, there will be nothing left to sell. Because quantity still seems more important than quality. So you can have some question marks about the quality of this debt, the underlying quality of this debt mountain. Does that mean that whenever the credit bubble bursts, that we have a financial crisis, a financial problem like we had in the States, the Lehman Brothers crisis? Not necessarily, because if we look at the reserves that were built up by China because of their trade surplus, their current account balance, if you look at the reserves, they represent 24-25% of their GDP, of their economy. So whenever the real estate bubble bursts, the credit bubble bursts, and there are financial difficulties within banks, they can save them. But still, it's something to look very carefully at and to pay attention to it. So this is one factor that keeps me awake at night. The second thing that keeps me awake at night is Greece. And not because of Greece. Not because of Greece. We can handle a Greek default. Financially, we can handle it easily. Greece represents 2% of the European economy. We can handle that. But why it keeps me awake is because the discussions that are taking place now, they illustrate a mentality at the political level. They illustrate that no one is interested in an economic or financial solution. But all the individual politicians are interested in their own solution for their own home country. And that keeps me awake. Because, to be honest, if I hear the arguments of the Greek government, of Mr. Varoufakis, I understand him. I understand him. If we look at the primary budget, the primary budget is the budget of a country without interest payments. It's the result of your daily operations in your country, your social security, your defense, etc. It's the result of your daily operations, your daily life. Then Greece had an improvement, it was minus 4% in 2009. It had an improvement of nearly 6% in 4 to 5 years. I guarantee you, if you would take these kind of measures in Holland, in Belgium, especially in France, then there would be a lot of victims in street protests. Especially where at the same time, every time the budget deficit is brought down, unemployment goes up. The more the budget improved, the more unemployment went up. And what the Greek people, what Greece needs, isn't money. It's not about money. Money is just a symptom. It's a symptom of a country that, in fact, is a default state. What Greece needs is to build up the underlying structure of the country. And what do I mean by that? It's not about money. I'm going to illustrate that. If we look at the blue line are the unit labor costs. The unit labor costs, that is the amount of labor costs that's within one piece of Greek economy. So you have an economic production, you take one entity of it, how many labor costs are in it? And the lower the unit labor costs are, the lower the labor costs within your economy, the more competitive you are. And during the last 5-6 years, unit labor costs decreased by 30%. Think of the street protests that would take place here if we are taking the same measures here. 35%. Why do you do that? Why do you do that? To become more competitive, to sell your products abroad, to stimulate your export, to become cheaper for the rest of the world. But unit labor costs went down, wages went down dramatically, but prices of Greek products and services, they moved hardly. They remained stable. So, despite the fact that the Greek people earned a lot less, competitiveness in terms of prices, Greek products did not become more interesting in terms of prices for the export market. And why is that? Why is that? Because it's a default state. It's a default state. A lot of product and service markets are protected. There are no free markets. there's a lot of corruption, there's a lot of red tape. So if you really want a solution for Greece, you're not discussing about the budget for this year or next year. You are discussing about how can we free up this market and this service and that service. So it isn't about money, it's just a symptom. And why it keeps me awake? Because they are holding the wrong discussions. They are not holding discussions as a European politician, but as a national politician who wants a political solution for its own home country. And that's bad for Greece, but it's also bad for Europe in the long run. And that's why it keeps me awake. And finally, what keeps me awake? Sometimes I sleep. The third thing that keeps me awake is the world. I was too fast. The world in general. And why the world in general? Because what determines the structural growth, the growth potential of an economy, of a national economy and of the world economy? Two factors. The first factor is the labor. I'm doing something wrong. The first factor is the labor force. Can help is there?
No problem.
The first factor is labor force. How many hands and heads do I have to produce? If you look at the world map that plots the world median ages, from this factor, from the growth of labor force, the economy won't be stimulated a lot. Because the more orange, the more red, the older the median age in the different countries. And what you see is that the only countries with green, so with a lot of young people, and yellow, it's in Africa or in political, not that stable regions. And if you look at the United States, if you look at Europe, even if you look at China, even if you look at Brazil, South America, if you look at Australia, labor force won't grow in the coming years, in the coming decades, probably. But the second factor that determines the structural growth capacity of your economy is productivity. How competitive you are, how productive you are, and the improvements therein. And there we see that the emerging countries, like Asia, okay, almost 4%, structural trend. But in the Western world, that's also down. 4 or 5 years ago, this was 5 to 6%. Even there, it's also down. But in the Western world, in the US, in Europe, it's only 2%, let's say. And if you look at the productivity, the evolution in the United States, trend is down. Trend is down. Because companies are not investing. Companies have a lot of cash in the United States. They have a lot of cash, and what do they do with it? They buy back shares. But they don't invest in capital. They don't invest in economic growth for the future, because consumption, that's economic growth now. Investment is economic growth in the future. And that keeps me awake for the United States, but also for Europe. If you look at German productivity, same trend. Same trend. We have, for the moment, we have an economic recovery, but to have a higher growth potential, a higher structural growth potential, we need investments. And the productivity, the improvement in productivity, it won't come from printing money. Printing money helps us now to experience a recovery. And that keeps me awake because, like I said, economics, it's about people. It's about people, so it's about sentiment. And for people, it's sometimes very difficult to have the view on the longer run, on the longer term. If in the short term it goes better, we are happy. But in the longer term, we risk to forget that, to neglect that. And to illustrate that, I'm going to give you a personal example. That's me. With glasses, but that's me. And me too, I'm a human being, despite being a banker. But I also must fight against that view in the short term. Because in the short term, when central banks in Europe, in Japan, in the US are printing money, in the short term I'm happy. Because I work for a private bank, we do asset management, we manage portfolio, and when central banks start to print money, markets go up. So as a banker, I'm very happy with that in the short term. And because markets, money is being printed, and European equities, American equities, emerging market equities all go up. But when the banker, one side of my personality, comes home and has breakfast in the morning, he's having breakfast with 3 daughters who are 15, 17 and 18. And these 3 daughters, they study very hard. They study very hard to prepare for life. But to implement their knowledge, to implement their character, to build out their life, they don't need printed money, which is very nice on the short term. They need a productive, competitive economy. And not a Dutch economy, not a Belgian economy, not a French economy. They need a European economy within a globalized world. And that keeps me awake. So, is there a recovery in growth? Yes, there is a recovery in growth. But the recovery, to a certain degree, is based on printing money, on a cheap currency, on lower oil prices, which is a small advantage that we have now, but which is not structural. We have to avoid a growthless recovery. We have to avoid an economic and social structure where the structural growth capacity has gone. So we have to invest. We have to invest to increase our future productivity. And I think that the investment, I count on you, on your sector. Because you are a sector that increases productivity of a company, of a country. You are in the investment sector. So now we have weekend within a few hours. Then some of you maybe go on a holiday. And let's say from the 1st of August on, you are going to invest to save the productivity of the worldwide economy. Thank you very much.